Welcome to Bar None, the American Bar Association's role in expanding justice for animals. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Raj Reddy, and I'm the Global Animal Law and Animal Law Advanced Degree Program Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dana Bray is a Climate Change and Animal Agriculture Senior Litigation Fellow and Project Manager for the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School. Dana is also currently co-chair of the American Bar Association's International Animal Law Committee and this year's recipient of the ABA TIPS Excellence in the Advancement of Animal Law Award. Joan Schaffner is Associate Professor of Law at George Washington University Law School, where she teaches civil procedure, sexuality in the law, remedies, and legislation and regulation. Joan is also a current co-chair of the American Bar Association's International Animal Law Committee. And finally, David Favor is Professor of Law at Michigan State University and Vice Chair of the ABA TIPS Committee. Over the past 30 years, he's written several articles and books dealing with animal issues, including topics such as animal cruelty, wildlife, the use of animals for scientific research, and international controls to regulate animal trade. Notably, all three of our panelists are co-authors of the Convention on Animal Protection Draft Treaty. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll begin with a presentation from Dana and Joan.
Good afternoon. We are honored to be presenting at this conference, one of the premier conferences on animal law. The theme for this year, Transforming Our Relationship with Animals, is an inspiring one and one that is consistent with the missions of the two animal law committees in the American Bar Association. The Animal Law Committee in the Tort, Trial, and Insurance Practice section seeks to address all issues concerning the intersection of animals and the law to create a paradigm shift resulting in a just world for all. And the International Animal Law Committee in the International section works to further animal welfare through advocacy and education on a worldwide basis. Today, Dana and I will share the work of the ABA at the forefront of shaping policy and public opinion regarding our relationship with animals. Through innovative resolutions addressing a wide array of contemporary issues, we are challenging assumptions that the ABA's motto of pursuing justice is limited to humans. Dana, for the animal lawyers and animal activists at this conference, even if they are not involved with the ABA, why is the animal law work of the ABA of interest to them?
Thank you, Joan. As you mentioned, the ABA's work for animals shows that work is part of lawyers' broader work for justice. The ABA mission is to defend liberty and deliver justice and to work for just laws. The Animal Law Committee's work shows that those concepts of justice and liberty and just laws should extend beyond humans. I also see the work of the ABA Animal Law Committees as of interest to the broader community of animal advocates and animal lawyers because they are a model of activism from within a formal established organization. And that is always a threshold decision for activists when looking at an issue on which they want to work. Should I work on this issue from within the structure of an existing organization, or should I work on it from outside? And I think looking at the work of the ABA Animal Law Committees is a really interesting example of effective work from within an existing organization. I also think the Animal Law Committees work is of interest to this conference because the Animal Law Committees have established a presence for animal law, a seat at the table of a very prominent organization. The ABA is one of the world's largest voluntary professional associations, and it's viewed generally as the voice of the U.S. legal profession. So for animal lawyers to be present at the ABA in this way is very significant. Another interesting aspect of the ABA Animal Law Committee's work is the educative value of the committees, both within and outside of the ABA. Outside of the ABA, when the ABA speaks on an issue or attends to an issue, that is of interest to media, to litigants, to lawmakers, and to advocates. Inside the ABA, for those of us who have been involved, we all know anecdotally that the animal law committees are educating our colleagues and the leaders of the ABA. As you mentioned, there are two animal law committees within the ABA. The The first committee was established in the Tort Trial and Insurance Practice section in 2004, so has been around for a long time. And the International Animal Law Committee was established within the International Law section in 2016. And we've all seen changes from within those ABA groups. We've seen our colleagues learn from the work of the animal law committees. We've seen our colleagues decide, for example, to adopt an animal rather than to purchase an animal because of what they've learned from the animal law committees. So I think that educative value is also of interest. And I wanted to close by mentioning what I see, and many of us who are active in the ABA see as the most relevant and exciting real-world work of the ABA animal law committees, and that is the work of the committees on policy resolutions. And we're actually going to spend quite a bit of time today on the policy resolutions because it is so impactful. To place you in this, the ABA House of Delegates is the legislative body that formulates ABA policy. The House of Delegates is large and diverse. It consists of many hundreds of members. It has representatives from every state and territory in the U.S., state bar associations, many local bar associations, judicial conferences of judges, all of the sections of the ABA, as well as the Attorney General of the United States and the Director of the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. So when that large House of Delegates goes through its formal legislative process and adopts policy, that policy is generally widely respected and viewed as sound and viewed as nonpartisan. Another exciting thing about ABA policy is that once the House of Delegates adopts a policy resolution, the lobbying arm of the ABA, the Government Affairs Office, can then lobby on that issue in Washington and engage in the lawmaking process. So that's very exciting. Moreover, and we've all seen this anecdotally and seen it through our work with other advocates, advocates can reference ABA policy when they're working on issues that the ABA has addressed. And again, if you have ABA policy on a matter, that policy is viewed as sound and worthy of serious consideration. Joan, please tell us about which animal law topics the ABA has addressed in policy resolutions and how the animal law committees choose those topics.
Great, thanks so much, Dana. There are several factors that we consider in choosing a topic for a resolution. First, ABA policy must serve the goals of the American Bar Association. Fortunately, those goals are quite broad, including working for just laws. Thus, we believe all of our resolutions promote that policy. However, as Dana will later explain, we often hear from delegates that the topic is not germane to the ABA. Second, each section has its own expertise and proposes resolutions that capitalize on that expertise. As we've said, the Animal Law Committee is in the Tort Trial and Insurance Practice section, and thus we're cognizant of selecting a topic that at least tangentially intersects with tort, trial, or insurance practice. Over the years, we've been able to argue somewhat successfully to section leadership that since the Animal Law Committee is the only animal law committee in the ABA focused on U.S. law, we believe that anything related to U.S. animal law is, by definition, within the expertise of the section. Similarly, the resolutions of the International Animal Law Committee in the international section must have an international connection. Third, we consider the politics involved and whether we believe there is a reasonable chance of persuading a majority of the House of Delegates to vote in support of the resolution. With each resolution, we're always careful to explain how the resolution serves the interests of all animals, human and non-human alike. Moreover, in recent years, we've been successful in securing co-sponsorship from other ABA sections that have intersecting expertise and interest, such as the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources, and the Criminal Justice section. The more co-sponsors, the greater the likelihood of passage. With these general parameters in mind, we then will select a topic that falls within one or more of the following areas: timeliness, emerging legislation or policy, and areas of activism and expertise of our own committee members. Timeliness has been a trigger for several of our resolutions. Unfortunately, it often takes a tragic event to raise the visibility of gaps in our laws that should be addressed to better protect animals. The first resolution of the Animal Law Committee was drafted in response to the devastating Hurricane Katrina. While there were many challenges related to the handling of animals lost or abandoned during the hurricane, one critical issue was how long the animals should be retained by shelters or rescues before they were put up for adoption. So the House of Delegates adopted a model act governing standards of care for and disposition of disaster animals that specifically addressed the question of proper holding periods to provide certainty of ownership for disaster animals. Similarly, the second Animal Law Committee resolution was triggered by several high-profile cases that resulted in the seizure of large numbers of animals, including the Michael Vick Bad News Kennels case. Municipalities and shelters often do not have protocols in place to adequately handle the seizure of large numbers of animals. So the House of Delegates adopted a resolution that provides specific guidance to lawmakers on developing laws to ensure the humane treatment and disposition of seized animals in a timely manner, including providing prompt and continuing veterinary care, humane and appropriate confinement, a timely process for evaluating each animal, and prompt transfer to an appropriate rescue organization or adoptive home, with humane euthanization occurring only if an animal's medical or behavioral condition warrants such action, or it is determined after reasonable time and effort had been expended that no appropriate placement for the animal exists. We were extremely fortunate to have one of the leading experts in this area, Rebecca Huss, who had been appointed the special guardian for the Vick dogs, as a member of the Animal Law Committee and who was a primary drafter of the resolution. And finally, a third Animal Law Committee resolution was drafted and adopted by the House of Delegates in response to the Zanesville animal massacre, when scores of exotic animals, including 18 rare Bengal tigers, 17 lions, 6 black bears, a pair of grizzly bears, 3 mountain lions, 2 wolves, and a baboon, all were slaughtered after their owner let them loose and then killed himself. The resolution urges the adoption of comprehensive laws that prohibit the private possession, sale, breeding, import, or transfer of dangerous wild animals, to protect public safety and health, and to ensure the humane treatment and welfare of the animals. Of course, at the time, several states and localities did prohibit the private ownership of wild animals, and thus this resolution was also designed to lend support to emerging legislation to persuade all states to prohibit the private ownership of such animals and avoid the horrific tragedy that took place in Zanesville, Ohio. Several other resolutions also were designed to persuade lawmakers to support emerging and/or ongoing legislative, regulatory, or policy efforts. For example, did you know that the number one reason a police officer discharges their weapon is to shoot a dog? The U.S. Department of Justice has recognized this and has materials available to help address the problem, but they're often not used. Moreover, a few U.S. cities have recognized the problem and have implemented non-lethal animal encounter training for their officers, but such training is not widespread. So the House of Delegates adopted policy that urges the enactment of laws and/or policies to provide law enforcement officers with comprehensive, non-lethal animal encounter training to better secure the safety of officers, to protect public health, to reduce legal liability, and to ensure the humane treatment of the animals encountered. And speaking of dogs, military working dogs, or MWDs, are increasingly deployed today by the United States and nations around the world to serve in warfare and international security details. Their keen abilities have proven to be highly effective for military duties and life-saving missions. Moreover, the MWDs and their human soldier partners develop strong bonds that help them to valiantly serve their regiments during deployment. However, often throughout the world, these dogs are not properly protected. In the United States, there have been efforts to implement welfare protections for them. In fact, in 2019, provisions were added to the Defense Appropriations Act to require that the military provide transportation back to the U.S. for decommissioned MWDs. So in an effort to help persuade Congress and other nations to enact laws to protect these dogs and their handlers, the House of Delegates adopted policy urging the adoption of laws, policies, and procedures that protect and provide for the health and well-being of all military working dogs, including to provide for military transportation back to their home country at decommission or retirement, to grant priority of first adoption at retirement to their veteran soldier handlers, and to ensure the provision of skilled veterinary care while in military service. One additional example of using the resolution process to secure support for ongoing legislative work is the recent International Animal Law Committee resolution that urges the U.S. and all nations to enact and enforce legislation that prohibits and penalizes the possession, sale, and trade of shark fins in light of the increasing decline in shark populations that threaten not only the individual lives of sharks, but threaten the extinction of their species and marine ecosystems. This resolution was designed to persuade U.S. states to follow the lead of a few of their sister states that have enacted similar laws, and to demonstrate support for the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act that was passed by the House of Representatives in 2019. Finally, resolution topics often focus on areas of activism and expertise of our own members. You'll recall that I mentioned that Rebecca Huss was involved in the drafting of the resolution that provides guidance on the humane treatment and disposition of seized animals, given her expertise as the special guardian for the Vic dogs. The humane treatment of outdoor community cats is actually a special interest of mine, as both an area of scholarship on which I have written and presented, and also as the mom to many felines who were once themselves community cats. Unfortunately, several localities forbid the use of Trap, Neuter, Vaccinate, Return, or TNVR programs for the humane and non-lethal management of community cat populations. So I was involved in the drafting and presentation of the resolution that urges legislative bodies and governmental agencies to allow the implementation and administration of TNVR programs for community cats to promote their effective, efficient, and humane management. And speaking of timing, we had the great fortune of presenting the TNVR resolution to the House of Delegates the same week that the rally cat went viral after he ran onto the field during the 6th inning of the baseball game between the St. Louis Cardinals and the Kansas City Royals. Rally cat now is in a loving home, enjoying life. There's another area of policy work that has related to several resolutions, to which Dana will now turn.
Thank you, Joan. Yes, an area in which the ABA, led by the TIPS Animal Law Committee, has been particularly effective and active is in the area of breed-specific legislation. For those who may not know, breed-specific legislation refers to laws that ban or restrict certain types of dogs based on their appearance or their perceived breed, on the basis that they are somehow inherently dangerous. These laws commonly apply to various types of dogs, including pit bull type dogs, which actually include a number of breeds. This topic is very close to my heart. This slide shows my two adopted American pit bull terriers, Riley and Manny. These laws, breed-specific legislation, are arbitrary and outdated. They limit people's rights to care for their family dogs. They can force people to give up their dogs, and they can ultimately result in dogs of these perceived breeds dying in greater numbers in shelters. For these reasons, the ABA Animal Law Committee has been particularly active. The TIPS Animal Law Committee has led the charge within the ABA in passing 3 resolutions that relate to breed-specific legislation. In August 2012, the ABA House of Delegates passed a resolution squarely addressing the problems with breed-specific legislation and calling instead for comprehensive, breed-neutral, dangerous dog or reckless owner laws. The ABA said this was important to ensure due process and to ensure responsible care for companion animals. So the ABA we see here is taking a common sense approach of focusing on the behavior of the individual dog and the individual person rather than relying on arbitrary breed bans. The ABA House of Delegates has also passed 2 other resolutions that address breed-specific issues and breed discrimination. First, in February 2012, the ABA House of Delegates passed a resolution saying that persons with disabilities using service animals should be provided with access in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, including by implementing a breed-neutral policy. So again, we saw here a focus on a case-by-case determination based on the individual animal and the individual person's behavior in that particular setting. Most recently, in February 2019, the ABA House of Delegates passed a resolution calling for uniform breed-neutral policies for families living in military housing. This is a really important resolution because it addresses the ongoing issue of hardship for military families with dogs because of the inconsistent breed discriminatory policies that exist across the various military branches and even within facilities and bases within one military branch. A family can be living with their good family dog and have a new posting to a new base, and suddenly their dog that was allowed at the prior posting is no longer allowed. This can be a hardship for military families, as you can imagine, and particularly for children who are already trying to adjust to a move without having to worry about whether their dog can accompany them. So you can see from these 3 resolutions that breed discrimination has been an active area for the ABA animal law committees. And I wanted to spend a little time to show how the ABA resolutions fit in with larger progress and activism on this issue. I'm not, of course, saying that the ABA work caused the progress that we saw on breed discrimination, but rather just showing how the ABA's animal law work can fit within a larger landscape of policy and activism. So as to breed-specific legislation or these breed bans, we saw them emerge in the late 1980s, and by 2013, which was around the time of the ABA resolution, there were 13 states that had looked at breed-specific legislation and said, this doesn't make sense. It's not good for families, it's not good for communities, and it's not good for dogs. So those 13 states had banned breed-specific legislation. Today, 22 states have banned breed-specific legislation. So this is an example of we see the ABA becoming active in an ongoing area of work and contributing to a trend. We know that advocates have used the ABA resolution to advocate for state laws ending breed-specific legislation in their states, just as they have relied on statements by other prominent organizations, including the American Veterinary Medical Association and the National Animal Care and Control Association, who have also spoken out against breed-specific legislation. In the area of military housing, as mentioned, we saw the ABA resolution in 2019 calling for a breed-neutral uniform policy. And closely following after that, in 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act, when it was passed by Congress, instructed the Department of Defense to develop a uniform policy for military housing. This is one where actually some of the groups who had long been working on this issue did credit the ABA's voice with helping to add to momentum. Shortly after the resolution was passed in 2019, the ABA president sent a letter to the Senate Armed Service Committee calling for a uniform breed-neutral policy. And right now, the Department of Defense is developing that policy, and groups are working to ensure that the end result will be a breed-neutral policy. So that was an exciting area of seeing the ABA resolution at work. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on breed discrimination in insurance, which in many ways is the emerging area of activism related to breed discrimination. Even where we have states that have banned breed-specific legislation within their borders, if national insurance companies continue to exclude certain breeds of dogs from the coverage of their homeowners policies, that can provide a real barrier to ownership of these dogs. We have seen starting several years ago, but picking up speed in 2020, the ABA Animal Law Committee starting to become active in this area. We've seen publication of an article in an ABA publication, members working on white papers, and then just this year, Nevada and New York became the first states to pass laws against insurance breed discriminations. Again, not caused by the ABA activity, but using this to illustrate how the ABA can fit within a legislative trend and can help add momentum for these causes.
So Dana, what is it like to work for animal protection within a formal professional organization, and what challenges have the committees experienced?
Thank you, Joan. As we've discussed over the course of this presentation, there are many advantages to working on animal law from within an organization like the ABA. We talked about how the ABA lends credibility to our work for animal law. We talked about the powerful symbolism and weight of the ABA's voice, and we talked about the educative value of the ABA's work both within and outside the ABA. There are challenges to working for animal law within the ABA. One is industry interests, and the ABA is a collective of lawyers who work in diverse industries, including lawyers whose clients work in animal use industries like animal agriculture and laboratory research. And as Joan said, this can influence which issues the ABA animal law committees take up to work on out of a practical consideration about which issues, may be able to be successful before the ABA House of Delegates. There's also an interesting debate going on now within the ABA, and I sort of use germaneness as shorthand to describe this debate. When we have taken animal law resolutions to the House of Delegates in recent years, we have heard a view expressed it's a minority position within the House of Delegates, but we have seen delegates address the House and say, animal law issues are not germane to the mission of the ABA, or they are outside of the core issues that the ABA should be working to address. And here on the slide, these are actual quotes from members of the House of Delegates who have taken to the floor to oppose animal law committee resolutions, not because of the content of the resolution. In fact, sometimes they say, it makes perfect sense to us that there should be legislation calling for police training on dog encounters to minimize shooting. But even though that's good policy, we should not be spending time on these issues here in the ABA. So from these quotes, you can get a feel for these positions that somehow this diminishes the power of the ABA or dilutes the work of the ABA. Interestingly, this issue has been complicated by there's a number of First Amendment challenges going on in the courts relating to mandatory or unified state bars. If you're not familiar, some states have voluntary state bar associations, and some states have bars associations which membership is required to practice law in the states. And members of mandatory state bars have filed various lawsuits alleging that when the state bar takes a position that is allegedly political or outside of the mission of the state bar, that is a imposition or a violation of the members' free speech or freedom of association rights. So there's this ongoing issue which has percolated up to the ABA about which issues state bars should speak on, and the animal law germaneness issue has sort of arisen at the same time within the House of Delegates, and it's made for quite an interesting debate. I am happy to report that this has remained a minority view within the House of Delegates, and we continue to explain in response why animal law is an important area of work for the American Bar Association. First, the American Bar Association exists to serve its members, and many of its members work in animal law or are interested in animal law, and the animal law work is of great value to us. And secondly, and this comes back to the theme that we've addressed throughout this presentation, the ABA's animal law work is an important part of the ABA's work for justice and for just laws. So these debates have been interesting but have not derailed the animal law resolutions. Despite these challenges, the most recently adopted House of Delegates resolution is actually one of the most progressive resolutions adopted to date, and it has the ability to secure significant advantages for animals internationally. Joan is going to tell us a little bit about this most recent resolution now.
Yes, thanks, Dana. The most recent House of Delegates resolution, which we adopted last February, was triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly a global tragedy, the pandemic demonstrated the unmistakable link among human health, animal health and welfare, and the environment, already widely recognized by the United Nations and the CDC under the One Health approach, as early reports had indicated that the virus likely originated in a Wuhan live animal market. Even today, while the exact origins of the virus remain disputed, the CDC states we know that COVID-19 originally came from an animal, likely a bat. In fact, it is estimated that 75% of emerging infectious diseases are caused by animal-to-human transmission, or zoonosis, with wildlife increasingly being the vector. The time to persuade the American Bar Association's House of Delegates, as well as policymakers worldwide, to consider a treaty for animal protection that would in turn force us to reevaluate humans' use and mistreatment of animals worldwide was 2020. Because even if leaders have little to no interest in protecting animals for their own sake, they all have an interest in protecting public health. Thus, we drafted such a resolution, urging all nations to negotiate an international convention for the protection of animals that establishes standards for the proper care and treatment of all animals to protect public health, the environment, and animal well-being. And it also encourages the U.S. State Department to initiate and take a leadership role in such negotiations. Throughout, the report emphasizes the link between COVID-19 and other zoonotic diseases and our mistreatment of animals, including the wildlife trade and the destruction of natural habitats that increases human contact with wild animals and increases the chance of spillover of deadly viruses. This resolution was a bit of a watershed moment for us, as it is clearly a progressive stand for the ABA to take. Although animal advocates and NGOs have discussed the possibility of such a treaty for many years, there has been no formal efforts to negotiate one. For example, the Global Animal Law Association, with the support of animal welfare NGOs, has urged the negotiation of a draft UN Convention on Animal Health and Protection, but no formal progress has been made. And this is not necessarily surprising, given that the Universal Declaration for Animal Welfare, with the support of millions of individuals and over 300 animal groups, has yet to gain traction with nation states. Although there are arguably many reasons for the lack of progress, one likely reason is that state leaders may not take animal organizations seriously. Of course, the American Bar Association is not an animal organization, far from it. Thus, we are hopeful that having the ABA endorse such a treaty might persuade nation states to realize that adoption of a convention on the protection of animals is a reasonable, important, and necessary proposal, and not only the vision of animal advocates. While the resolution urges nations to negotiate an animal protection treaty, it does not endorse any specific provisions, and this was deliberate. The treaty will involve many varied provisions governing all animal communities and our use of and relationship with animals. And the American Bar Association is just not in a position to draft such language, nor even to endorse specific language that requires specialized knowledge of zoonotic diseases and animal health and welfare across many species. Of course, the effectiveness of the treaty is a function of the specific provisions of the treaty, its implementation, and its enforcement. But those details we left for future work, the work to which we now are going to turn. David Faber is a member of the International Animal Law Committee and the Animal Law Committee in the ABA and co-wrote the resolution and report. Perhaps more importantly, he was among the first advocates to argue for a treaty on animal welfare some 30 years ago. David recognized then that negotiations for an animal welfare treaty should only proceed if there is some level of belief that the results of the negotiations will not simply make present animal welfare treatment the global standard. The ABA endorsed a resolution with the understanding that it, in fact, would promote public health, the environment, and animal well-being, and did not contemplate allowing animal exploiters to capture the process and set standards in a treaty that would, in effect, enhance the economic and therefore political power of the global and national corporations that control and exploit so many millions of animals. Thus, David and the other drafters turned our attention to drafting a treaty, the Convention on Animal Protection for Public Health, Animal Welfare, and the Environment, CAP for short. And David will now present on those efforts and CAP.
Greetings, everybody. My name's David Favor, a professor of law at Michigan State University, and I'm here to talk about the proposed treaty for consideration of animals on a global basis. There are a number of ideas that we need to first talk about before I get to any actual language of the treaty, but we'll get to that. First of all, what is a treaty? And what use is a treaty, and what are the limitations of a treaty? Now, most of us have become very familiar with law in the United States, and we understand what the word law means. And here we're trying to create some international law, but we must understand the limitations of what the word law means at the international level. That there is no majority vote. Every country gets the decision to either join a treaty or not join a treaty, or even to walk away from a treaty. So it is very difficult to gather countries together in one place to talk about a topic on an ongoing basis, but that is the point of a treaty. So the treaty language has to attract countries to come together to, one, take up the treaty and adopt the treaty, and then secondarily, they have to come together on a regular basis after that to implement the treaty. So there's two steps involved here. And we've drafted a treaty that we think will be sufficient as a starting point for other countries. We've done some legwork for them. We've given them something to work from so they don't have to start with a blank piece of paper. Now, there are advantages to having a treaty, particularly a treaty on animal welfare. And some of those are that the mere existence of the treaty gives more visibility to the ideas and concerns that are within the treaty. This means visibility within other countries and visibility within the domestic arguments that might occur within a country. Because once you have floating out here this international treaty, then domestic actors can take advantage of that and talk to their country about issues that are in the treaty. The other thing is to understand that it does create, ultimately, international standards of practice for whatever the topic is that is involved, whether it's human rights or environmental, in CITES example, protection of endangered species. And here we're talking about two things, particularly COVID and welfare standards for animals in a more broad sense. The other thing that occurs that isn't perhaps as obvious is when you have an international treaty and meetings occurring within that, under the umbrella of that international treaty, then you have individuals coming from various countries together to meet and talk about the particular topic that's involved. And this provides an educational process for various countries and individuals within their countries about what is going on a global basis. And it sets hopefully a higher tone and standard for that particular issue in countries that previously perhaps had not been as concerned as might be the case. So the key concept for the drafting and consideration of the treaty is the concept of sovereignty, and that each country does have the right to make its own decisions for both the people and the environment that exist within their countries, and people cannot force standards upon them. So an international treaty is a place to create those standards that hopefully will then draw in the various countries to become part of a global effort to deal with an issue. As you might be aware or might not be aware, I helped draft a treaty some 30 years ago on animal welfare issues, and it's sort of stagnant. There wasn't enough idea of support around on a global basis to move forward with that treaty. But recently, there has been more. The internet has provided more global communication between people, and so that NGOs in various countries can access what's happening in other places and access literature about what's happening and what options might be available. So I've seen a tremendous growth in the interest in the international treaty in the last 5 or 6 years, I'd say. Then we add on top of that COVID and the devastation that's come with the COVID. And I think that has also brought home to people that while there's still some dispute about exact origin of this particular COVID virus in China, there's no question that the jump from wildlife and the viruses they have into humans has been something that's happened in the past and will happen in the future if we don't have more focus on it. And at the moment, there is no international treaty that provides a focus on the issue of viruses in populations in wildlife and what to do about it. Either identify where they are, which animals are involved, or then what to do about that as well. And it is a difficult problem, the one that science is just now grappling with, helping identify the nature of the risk. In engaging in the drafting process, I find that it's helpful to have a metaphor that people can understand what we're about. And that is that I think we are constructing a train. We are constructing like engineers. We're putting pieces together and we're presenting then a finished product that would be a train, the engine and the various pieces that might be after the engine. We do not, because we are not the states, we cannot drive the train. Only states can drive the train. And additionally, I don't know where they're going to go with it. It's almost impossible to predict right now what will happen in 30 years with the document we're dealing with right now. It could be extremely positive for animals in 30 years, or it could have petered out and not become particularly effective at all. We don't know. But what I do know as a drafter of the treaty is that we need to provide as many doors as possible so that it can be expanded from its present 20-page document into much larger documents with various other and more detailed concerns about animals. So this is the idea of creating a document that has possibilities of expansion. And one of the techniques we use for that, for this treaty, and that have been used in others, is the idea of an umbrella treaty, and then under that, protocols that can be developed under the general theme of the umbrella, but in much more detail. One of the problems with treaties is that if we have too much detail in the initial treaty and listing of things and absolute standards, that countries may not be ready to do those, and therefore they won't be joining the treaty. So instead, what we have is we provide places where treaties can be expanded by the adoption of annexes, which would be by majority vote at various conferences of the parties to create more numbered and nuanced list of things that need to be considered. Like, what are the 10 most important species on a global basis that might represent threats for the transfer of viruses to humans? I don't have the answer to that. I'm not sure science has the answer to that yet, but it's a very important list to have, and that's one of the tasks that we set out for the Conference of the Parties to come into the future once a treaty becomes effective, is going through the science of identifying which species need to be focused upon in what parts of which countries as well. One of the difficulties with animal welfare generally has been, although there has been significant improvement in domestic legislation in a number of countries, not in every country. So it's there, it has a visibility and it has a percolation that's occurring, but it's not a top concern for most countries. COVID, however, I think is a top concern for almost all countries. Clearly dealing with the present spread of the COVID virus, and then also thinking about how do we try to keep this from happening again. So COVID is our crack in the door, we think, that would allow us to get to talk to states and present an alternative or a path forward that they can then discuss among themselves about how to proceed with the treaty. We understand that once we give our treaty to a state, it might be the UK, it might be the Netherlands, it might be India, it might be which country is going to take it up first, but we then lose control of it. So we hope we've created a robust and sharp document that they will be comfortable working from to move forward. Also understand there are probably some topics that we generally are going to stay away from at this time because we don't think most countries are ready to actually address in any detail. And one of those, it will be disappointing to many of the people in this audience, I know, and that is the concept of animal rights. The states of the world are not ready to talk about animal rights as we understand the conversation in many of the common law countries of the world and in the EU. We can talk about animal welfare, but animal rights is simply too exotic, too far out there. Countries do not now presently do a good job of implementing human rights. So to talk about animal rights would be an insult to so many humans, millions of humans around the world who have not yet obtained their rights first. So we're not going to talk about animal rights. We have just a couple of sentences in the introduction to the treaty I'll show you that do express an animal philosophy without saying the term animal rights. But that's, again, something that might be in the future, but is not the focus of what we're going to be doing here. Another thing that you'll probably be disappointed in is how little we touch upon commercial animals, animals for food. And I think that that is simply a huge mountain to climb, given the financial existence of global corporations, billion-dollar corporations, who have a vested interest in the existing system, as horrible as it is, and have also well placed themselves within the interest of many governments, such that to take on changing farm animal structure as an opener for this is simply a non-starter in our judgment. But we have provided the door that if in 10 or 15 years the world is ready to take on international standards for food animals, then there will be a place for them, absolutely. But right now, the language is very modest that deals with commercial animals, but they are present, and that's what I think is important for future. One reference point in the drafting of this treaty that I've had in my mind is that we have to draft something that will entice countries like India, Brazil, and China to become part of this treaty for it to be functional and meaningful. And so, that's part of my drafting, is thinking about, will this offend these countries to such a degree that they're going to lead the discussion, or can they handle this and come in and become part of the discussion? And that's a difficult judgment call to make in all cases. Now, I'd like to move to some of the language of the treaty that we have. And here we have language from the introduction to the treaty. And the first acknowledgement is to deal with COVID. We want to make it clear that this treaty has a primary focus on trying to help with the issue of COVID. So here we have acknowledging the inappropriate contact with and treatment of animals by humans is a risk factor for the emergence and transmission of zoonotic viruses and other pathogens such as COVID-19, which can be mitigated through coordinated international action integrating human health, animal health, and the protection of the environment through the One Health concept. This One Health concept is something that not all citizens in the U.S. are particularly aware of, but it is a fairly recent, just the last 5 years, has this started to arise on the horizon, where the disparate groups of concern are coming together to understand that human health and animal health and environmental health really are fully intertwined, and that we need to think about One Health, meaning we have to always consider, when we're dealing with one of those three factors, the impacts in the other factors. And this bringing animal welfare in with human welfare, COVID is a clear example of where that's necessary, is now allowing for a robust consideration of a number of factors. Now, we have a whole page of acknowledgments and declarations in our treaty, but the second one I want to show you here is the one declaring that animals as sentient beings have an inherent dignity, worth, and welfare interests that must be conceived of broadly and whose well-being must be protected. One of the real discussions that we had as a drafting group was how to perhaps move beyond the word welfare, which has a historic sense of the 5 freedoms that came out of the UK in the 1960s, which actually is limited in how it looks at the animal. And so we have chosen, while we use the word welfare in the title of the treaty, to try to expand that. Welfare interests must be conceived broadly and whose well-being must be protected. Well-being meaning you deal with the whole animal, the mind of the animal, the socialization of the animal, the other things that give the animal quality of life. And so we're going to use the term well-being throughout the treaty when we refer to what we want to accomplish for animals. And we hope that this will be a modest conceptual door that I don't think would, if we said whose rights, we can't say whose rights, But I think well-being is something broader than just welfare, but would not be a red flag to parties saying they wouldn't join a treaty that said well-being. I don't think that they would be that offended by what it is. What is it that this treaty is going to do on the issue of COVID and other viruses? Well, here's some of the overarching language to the details that we have. The contracting party shall take all necessary steps to identify species susceptible to be reservoirs or host of viruses and other pathogens that may spill over into humankind and regulate interactions among those species, humans, and other animals. So you got identifying both the species and where they're located, and then regulating the interaction between those species and humans and animals. And the primary thing that the regulation is going to deal with, we foresee, is that we want to keep separate. We want to keep domestic animals and humans away from those wild species that represent the most risk, to give them special treatment of isolation. This gets down into more details. Article 4, what will happen once they have that list of species. Then it asks the party states in their domestic legislation, in other words, they've made this identification as part of the international obligations, but now the treaty says, now that we've delegated that, we need to have you do certain acts within your own legal system. And that would be to prohibit the capture of wildlife, the keeping, sale, purchase, and farming of these particular species that are within a country. To deal with the issue of live animal markets, we all saw pictures of what live animal markets look like because of COVID. And I think almost any normal human seeing the stacks of animals on top of each other would suggest, and the level of confinement that those animals are placed in these live markets would say, we either need to prohibit these or that they should be expressly regulated so as to provide health and well-being for the humans and the animals involved. And then to adopt conservation, mitigation, and adaptation plans on wildlife management, again, perhaps to provide buffers and protections for the wildlife that we don't want to kill off this wildlife. That's not what we're about. We're about causing the separation of the wildlife so that humans have much less of a risk of capturing them. Now we do then move on into other animal issues, and with varying degrees of sophistication within the treaty language itself. Again, each one of these articles could become their own protocol. You will have a little sub-treaty just on captive wildlife care. All right, but here we've not gone into the details that might be provided and simply make a general obligation statement. The contracting party shall take all necessary steps to ensure that captive wildlife are provided an appropriate species-specific environment and the necessary care for their well-being, again, mitigate risk of spillover of zoonotic viruses and other pathogens, and prevent cruelty and unnecessary suffering of captive wildlife, including by evaluating whether species well-being can be provided for in captivity. I think that gives the states a strong direction to go with captive wildlife care, and it does say shall take all necessary steps. We've used the word shall. That's very important in treaties. That means it's an obligation. It doesn't say may, or if they feel like it, they could. We've tried to use the strong word there, and the strong word in international treaties is the word shall. The companion animals, Article 10, it has perhaps the most detail, and it has more detail than I'm giving you right here on the slide. We've done both a positive and negative for those who have companion animals. Of course, we had to define companion animals. That's always a bit of an issue even in domestic legislation. You can imagine at the international level, it's more subtle even than domestically. But here we say this is what a keeper of a companion animal. We don't say owner, we say keeper. If you're the owner, or whether whoever has dominion and control over the animal would have these obligations. Provide the care and attention required by the species and breed of the animal, and in particular, shall provide suitable and sufficient food and water. That's pretty standard. That's now globally recognized, I think, without much problem. Animal with adequate shelter from abusive environmental conditions. Notice that we haven't said what that would be, That's too much detail. There's too many variations per species, per weather environment. We simply have given them the obligation to provide adequate shelter in domestic legislation. Provide an animal with adequate opportunities for exercise. Provide an animal with appropriate socialization and mental stimulation. That, I think, is what is relatively new in dealing with animal welfare issues, and one we hope that will open up the consideration for the full well-being of the animals. And then finally, to take reasonable measures to prevent escapes. Some animals represent risk to people, and we'd like to minimize that possibility. Then on the stopping the bad things side, we have another one within Title 10. The keeper of the companion animal shall not subject animals to cruel acts or conditions. That's also pretty well accepted under animal welfare just about everywhere. Restrain an animal so as to preclude it from obtaining adequate food and water and shelter. That obviously deals with leashes and tying animals up or keeping them separate from where the food and water is. Train an animal in a way that is detrimental to its health or cause unnecessary pain or suffering. This might have something to do with animals, companion animals used in entertainment, or certainly in fighting animals. We can't have that happening there either. Use animals by forcing it to exceed its natural capacities or strengths. So we're trying to put outer limits on what you can do with your companion animal. These are the other categories that we have provisions in the treaty that I didn't think I'd have time to go through today, of one or up to 3 paragraphs, so just to give you a sense of what we think are sort of the chunks of topics that can be taken up within protocols for future consideration by the party states. Wildlife management and habitat, transportation of animals, commercial animals, animals used in scientific research and testing, animals used in entertainment. As you are well aware, I think people at this conference would be well aware of how rich some of those and how difficult some of those topics are to deal with. I think in testing we push the envelope pretty well within the treaty itself and want to outlaw cosmetic testing as a specific focal point that almost all states that are considering that now have come to accept that we can outlaw cosmetic testing in the near term, hopefully. Scientific research is a more touchy subject generally, and I don't think we have a consensus on that, so that we have more general statements about animals used in research. Used in entertainment, that's also something that's pretty well accepted nowadays, but we don't have an extensive things. We do not touch upon bullfights or rodeos specifically, but we do suggest that they shouldn't be killed for purposes of entertainment. So the rest of the treaty, there's many paragraphs that talk about how they get organized, how they hold the conferences, how they make decisions in meetings, and the requirement that agencies be created. This is one of the important parts of the treaty, is that each state is obligated to create an agency under its own umbrella, and that will create a set of people who are then attuned to and become advocates for the issues that are within the treaty. And they hopefully would seek out budget and resources and begin to develop a scientific base of information so they become sophisticated within the government that's involved, the state that's approved. And with that, they will be able to move forward, hopefully. One has to be hopeful in this. One must be positive in this because otherwise it's not going to happen. And I do think history suggests the environmental movement has seen extraordinary explosion of international focus and concern. If you started in 1960, when the movement, the first Earth Day, existed, and how the vast majority of the globe knew nothing about environmental issues at that point in time. And then by the Rio Conference in 1992, all countries knew about it. All countries came to the Rio Conference and began their consideration of the really serious issues, biodiversity loss and the issue of global warming. Now, we haven't resolved them, but we've created the structures internationally that will help to resolve these issues. And so for animal welfare, we want to do the same thing. We need a start point. And we understand it may take literally decades to build a robust international system that will help animals, but there's no fast way forward. It's simply, this is the path available to us so long as we have sovereign states. This is the relatively slow, but then the whole point is that countries that buy into this and develop an interest in it become self-educated about it and hopefully move animal welfare priorities up the list of what the government is actually concerned about. So I think that's my introduction to the treaty. I hope that I've helped you look at this. Please understand that the treaty we've drafted is available now, but it is expected that we will have a website with the full treaty as attached to the website for everybody to take a look at. To the extent we can get the help of people in the audience to support the treaty, that would be fantastic. And to the extent that you could reach out to a country and ask that they consider this treaty as an action that they might take up, that would even be better. So with that information, I think I'll be around for questions after this presentation. So thank you all so much for letting me come and talk to you today.
Greetings, everyone. Now we'll begin our Q&A with our speakers. To submit your questions, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to try and splice a couple of questions here into one. I think Joan and Dana, this is mostly for you, but David, please feel free to add. For those who aren't members of the ABA, and even for those who are, how might we get more involved with animal law and the ABA, and anything specific to how students or students who are recently graduated, how they can get involved?
Thanks, Raj. I think I'll take that first. As you all know, from my introduction, I teach at the George Washington University Law School. And I'm, of course, the faculty advisor to our Student Animal Legal Defense Fund. We have a really robust and great student group. And I also work with the students in our Animal Law Committee and TIPS, as well as those in the International Animal Law Committee. I personally think that the American Bar Association and joining the two committees is a wonderful opportunity for all lawyers, but certainly for student members. And I wanted to give you guys a little bit of insight, I guess, into what else we do. We talked mostly about our policy work, which we think is of the most very, very critical to using the ABA as a means of giving voice to animals and helping promote policy. But we do a lot of other things as well. So just to give you a quick summary of that, for example, the Animal Law Committee is subdivided into a variety of subcommittees. Subcommittees on companion animals, on animals used in research and testing, agricultural animals, equine, wildlife. And within those subcommittees, we've got individuals who are active in animal law in those areas. And so for student members in particular, it gives them a great opportunity to focus their attention within those animal communities and to meet lawyers that are working in these areas. In the International Committee, we have two working groups, one on international wildlife crime and another on climate change. And these have been very robust committees working on policy and a variety of other things. And again, it gives students an opportunity to really get involved in those particular subject matter areas. We also do a lot of programming. We've got some great webinars. We have created a YouTube channel that provides links to the webinars both the Animal Law Committee and the International Committee have worked on. Just to give you an idea of some of the recent ones from this year, particularly from the International Animal Law Committee, we have webinars on rewilding, on international farmed animal laws, on wildlife trafficking in the maritime industry, extrajudicial killings of indigenous forest defenders in Brazil, and the rights of and to nature. And that's just a sampling of the webinars we just put on this year. And those webinars are not only available for students to see, but we really try to get students involved with these webinars. Also, the Animal Law Committee puts on a shelter law symposium every year. We've been doing that for many years. That brings in a tremendous amount of people interested in shelter law, and again, gives students a great opportunity to meet with folks that are working in the area. We also do publications. We've got great substantive newsletters, and those newsletters are now available on Hein Online, a variety of books. In fact, we have an animal law careers book that I would recommend to all of the students in the audience that give you just a snapshot into the different kinds of careers you can have in the animal law arena. We have a book, Litigating Animal Law Disputes, and a book on wildlife law and ethics. In addition, every year we do a year in review, both internationally and within the tort trial and insurance practice section, that also provides what's really been going on with respect to animal law in that current year. And then finally, what I think is probably the most fun and also very useful is we are great at public service. We haven't had a chance in the last year or so to meet in person, but our animal law committee, whenever we meet with TIPS meetings, we often have a public service project. And our most recent one was so much fun. Dana actually was the one that put this together. We went out to the Leilani Farm Sanctuary in Maui. And we cleaned out the barn. But while we were doing that, we also met some really wonderful animals and had just a terrific time. And that's just one of the many public service events we do. And then most recently, we have a pro bono project where we're working with, we're putting volunteer lawyers together with animal shelters to support their foster programs, to help both the shelters, the animals, and the communities, especially during the pandemic. When a lot of animals needed much more fostering since the shelters were having to close. So I would say that for all lawyers, but particularly for students, you can get publication opportunities through our newsletters, through our articles and our books. You can get speaking opportunities through our webinars. And the main thing is you can get network and meet a lot of great lawyers who are compassionate about animals and are involved in the animal law work.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Joan. And yeah, everything Joan said just illustrates why the animal law committees are such a great opportunity for law students and for lawyers. And, Joan's overview gives you a sense of the breadth of work, the different kinds of things we do, the different topics that we address. I got my introduction to animal law through the ABA animal law committees. It's a great way for students and lawyers to do that. And then the networking is just incredible. We would love to have new members. You can reach out to any of us for more information. And the main thing, if you do join, you can be sort of a passive member and just learn from all of the great educational offerings. But to get the full networking benefit, what I encourage everyone to do is take something on when you join, write a newsletter article, join a subcommittee, and then people will get to know you through the work. Thank you.
And I'll just add to those excellent answers. For students, some of the subcommittees in the ABA tips section allow for student chairs. So if you're particularly interested in a particular animal issue, you can have sort of an opportunity to actually drive what that subcommittee does over the course of that year. Thank you. So
Raj, did we mention the most important thing, that ABA membership is free for law students? So there's no reason not to join. Thank you.
We have another question. So this, I think, is for you, David. Is it advisable for the Treaty on Animal Protection, the Convention on Animal Protection, to include a clause for all signatories to the treaty to commit to the phasing out of commercial wildlife farming in stages, say phasing out 20% of the commercial breeding operations by 2040 and phasing out the rest by 2060, or something sort of similar to the commitment to reducing emissions?
Well, that topic is certainly one we want to have addressed. And I think that it would be nice, but I think that's one level of detail too soon. I think we have to have the parties into the treaty and that's a great thing to tape up at a conference of the parties, a resolution be adopted that would set out those guidelines, or the adoption of an appendix that might set out some guidelines for it. But I think there'd be a number of countries who aren't ready to do that yet. And so I don't want them to use the presence of that language to preclude them from joining the treaty. We want to get them under the umbrella and then discuss it at conferences of the parties.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question related to the cap. Are there any organized efforts to advocate nationally for the adoption of the cap? So any NGOs who are actively working to lobby for their country becoming a signatory?
Well, we've just entered that phase. We just finished with the drafting. So now the efforts will be focused upon outreaches to various countries. And we hope that we could get the support of organizations on a global basis to then lobby within their own country. And so we're just now getting that organized, and we'll be, if there's somebody who wants to particularly be active in that, please let us know, and we'll be happy to make sure we link up.
Thank you. This question, I believe, is for everyone. What kind of support roles are available for non-lawyer professionals to get involved in animal law?
Well, I might suggest one thing is to work with, I assume you must be in a law firm, is to move the law firm to a point of being able to do pro bono work in the area of animal law and find an attorney within the firm who might be in fact interested in doing that and form a partnership up with them.
I will say that the American Bar Association has membership opportunities for what I believe we refer to as associate members who are not actual lawyers. I wasn't sure if the question was for lawyers who aren't involved in animal law or people who aren't lawyers who want to do some work. And we sort of have everybody in the animal law committee. We have a lot of lawyers who are not full-time animal law lawyers, but who are interested in animal law work, and they are able to participate through our committees. And we can also bring in people who are not lawyers, but who may be veterinarians or work otherwise with animals. And in fact, having that synergy is really terrific, particularly with this One Health approach that we've been talking about. There's a lot of opportunities for lawyers and veterinarians and others to work together to promote the interests of animals. So you can become a member of the ABA and still work and participate within our committees, even if you're not a lawyer or a law student.
Thank you so much. Another question. Are there any thoughts to moving the Animal Law Committee to its own practice section as opposed to being under TIPS?
There's a lot of history there.
Yeah.
It is not a big enough topic. There's not enough practicing lawyers, particularly when it was created, to justify that level of status within the ABA. There's thousands of people that are involved, and we're a modest community at this point in time.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, once we've been created, I'm not sure about the possibility of moving forward at some point, but we've found homes and we've become respected in these homes. So I don't think there's an urge to move us anywhere else.
Well, I'll also say, I mean, with the International Animal Law Committee coming into play in 2016, so we have now the two committees, and we work very, very closely together. All of us are members of both committees. Not all of us. I mean, all of us here on the panel are, but many of us do have overlaps. And I do think the other way to sort of work our way through the ABA is to also create animal law committees potentially in other sections of the ABA. And at some point in time, right, we might actually be big enough for a section. But as David said, I think actually the ABA is talking about consolidating sections right now. So that may not be the way to go really with respect to it. But I don't feel, I mean, the bottom line is, I don't think we're at any disadvantage for not being a section. In fact, I think it may be an advantage to be part of a section that has great leadership, that has a lot of, the TIPS section is very well respected within the ABA. And so we're able to sort of garner, and so is the international section for that matter. And so we're able to sort of garner that reputation and use that as means of promoting our, our resolutions, particularly through the House of Delegates. So like I said, it's just a different way to approach it, but I don't really think it's lesser in any regard.
Thanks so much, Joan, for that answer, and David. I think we have time for one last question. This question asks, so in relation to the International Treaty, the CAP, what would be your message for the animal rights? And I think this means animal rights with a capital R movement to support the CAP, taking into account that the CAP is more welfarist or well-being oriented than sort of rights or abolitionist oriented.
Well, I think that's pretty easy, actually. I think most people that have gone through this process understand that normally there's first a concern for welfare for individual animals and their pain and suffering. And it's later in your thought process that you mature to the area of actually talking about rights as a path forward of obtaining better animal welfare. So we have to think of all these countries are like individuals, okay? And they all have their own personalities, they have their own history and priorities, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you capture their attention better by moving forward with welfare first. And in 10 or 20 years, let's talk about rights.
And I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.